This lecture is supposed to be about happiness, but really it's about a guy named Jack Whittaker who should have been the happiest man on earth. He won the Powerball lottery in 2002, worth a cool $315 million. $314.9 million to be exact. That's enough money to make an entire country happy. At first, it seemed he was happy. He gave away substantial amounts of money and things, even expensive things like houses and cars, some to near strangers. He started a charitable foundation. With that kind of money, he was poised to leave the world in a lot better shape than he found it. But he didn't. Cautionary tales usually have dark sides, and this one sports a whopper. Jack started gambling. He was arrested twice for driving while under the influence. He lost $545,000 cash when somebody broke into his car while Jack was visiting a strip club. His granddaughter died of an overdose of drugs. He didn't pay his gambling debts, and the casinos sued for non-payment of funds. His money was mostly gone by 2007. Jack's famous for saying, quote, "I wish I'd torn that ticket up," close quote. What is this mysterious substance of happiness? Why couldn't Jack keep hold of a fortune most of us shaking our boots dreaming about? What is happiness to the human brain? That's our subject for this lecture. I'm going to divide our talk about happiness into two parts. In part one, I will discuss the characteristics of happiness, definitions, my take on nature and nurture considerations. In part two, I'll talk about what makes people happy, then briefly describe its absence, which most people call depression. The practical application will end our discussion, hopefully on a positive note. It will describe what research shows makes most people happy over the long term, and along the way, we'll talk about more lottery winners. You've got your winning ticket in hand. Let's get started. What exactly does it mean to be happy? How do you distinguish it from, say, contentment, from satisfaction, from pleasure? Truth is, we don't know. The words may all be describing something similar. That's another way of saying that semantic differences aren't necessarily biological ones. For my money, words like contentment and satisfaction are separable phenomenon only if you don't look too closely. Pleasure probably having the most unique distinguishing characteristics from the happy pack. I know you're tired of hearing this, but getting to a definition, as ever, is just plain hard work. The one characteristic that holds up well, regardless of how you define happiness, is that everybody seems to experience it differently. The concept is so dependent on individual experience, researchers have come up with a different name. The word happiness is not generally used. More common are the words subjective well-being, or SWB, which simply kicks the can down the road, albeit with a bit more technical panache. How does one define happiness in scientifically meaningful fashion? Doing so requires a great deal of asking people about their feelings. This is called self-report. Now, I admit, basing research on self-report makes me queasy. Not always reliable. There are researchers who think it's doable, though, and they get the definitions. One such researcher is psychologist Ed Diener. He's done as much as anyone to characterize happiness in the global village. In fact, he's called Dr. Happiness. He describes SWB, remember that stands for subjective well-being, as, quote, people's cognitive and affective evaluations of their lives. Ed has used this definition in a courageous attempt to codify the experience across the United States and then around the world despite stout intellectual headwinds. He even created a test where you can score your own happiness and compare yours to other people's scores from Camden to Copenhagen. It's called the Satisfaction with Life Scale, or SWLS. originally published in the Journal of Personality Assessment. If you'd like to see where you stand, it's easy to find the instrument online. As you'll discover if you take it, there are many variables that go into your subjective sense of well-being, and so tests like these have to be taken with a fairly large grain of salt. As usual, there are both nature and nurture issues to consider, which you can see everywhere if you know where to look. I see tremendous examples of nature and nurture in happiness issues every time I think about Winnie the Pooh and his group of companions. Consider the delightful case of Tigger. In case you've forgotten, Tigger's a rambunctious, tiger-like creature who's always moving, always laughing, and recoils off any number of surfaces in a parkour kind of way. He says of himself with ebullience, "Bouncing is what Tiggers do best." Tigger seems to be born happy, ebullient, possessed of a wonderful sense of himself. "The wonderful thing about Tiggers," the orange cat exclaims in full-throated Disney-esque optimism, "is that Tiggers are wonderful things." His happiness thermostat seems to be permanently set on high. Contrast that with another character out of Milne's imagination, the little donkey Eeyore. This animal seems to be born on the emotional opposite page of Tigger. He's slow. He's plodding. His speech is sluggish. His quotes make him sound a little depressed. He says of his living quarters, "Not much of a house, just right for not much of a donkey." Even things that make other people happy don't seem to affect him much. When he loses his tail, a variety of substitutes are offered him, including a beautiful red balloon. His reaction? "Sure is a cheerful color. Guess I'll have to get used to it." Eeyore's happiness thermostat seems to be set permanently on low. I bring up Winnie the Pooh characters in a discussion about happiness because of this thermostat idea. It's a perfect metaphor for our discussion of the nature side of happiness. Martin Seligman, a world-famous psychologist and an expert on human mood, believes we are born with a happiness set point. If your happiness is normally high, but then your girlfriend breaks up with you, you will be down for a while, but at some point your set range gets violated, your feelings get too low, your mood alarm goes off. As a result, you turn on some SWB heat. Eventually, you return to your natural happiness temperature. If your happiness is set too high, say you win the lottery, the system works in reverse. Eventually, turning on some SWB air conditioning, you return eventually to the same happiness you had before winning. That's why I include the house at Pooh Corner metaphor. Tigger's set point is obviously tuned to a higher range than Eeyore's. Their happiness set points, like yours, are conceived by some researchers as being more or less a permanent feature of your personality. That means your set range is in part biologically determined. Genetic, perhaps, which means it's mostly concerned with how well you chose your parents. There is evidence to suggest these same psychologists might really be onto something. Studies on twins reveal that the SWB scores, remember that subjective well-being, are experienced alike regardless of the environment in which the twins are raised. A happiness set range could even explain something about lottery winners. People who win are predictably ecstatic for a while, but only for a while. Within 3 months, settling has occurred for most. They have returned to the happiness set point they had before they got their big wins. Except poor Jack Whittaker at the center of our cautionary tale, who seems to have gone off the deep end. Nature is hardly the whole story regarding happiness, of course. Martin Seligman himself says that set ranges are only part of the story, that a great deal of happiness includes environmental factors and choices that are completely under your control. What are these? Well, we answer this question in our next section entitled Happiness and its absence. I can sum up what research says makes you happy in 2 sentences. Number 1, relationships make you happy. Number 2, money does not. I'll say that again. Relationships make you happy. Money does not. One of the most potent, surefire ways to sustain happiness in your life has to do with relating to other people. Cultivating and maintaining lots of friends, to name one example. The more friends you have in your life, and the more you interact with them, the happier you are statistically likely to be. In the novel A Christmas Carol, the ghost of Christmas past shows Scrooge an earlier life. He's in the midst of a happy community his employer named Fezziwig had made for him. Lots of laughter, lots of friends, lots of subjective well-being. Ditto for Bob Cratchit's family, ditto for Scrooge's nephew's family. Researchers have studied happiness in people since before World War II. One famous study has tracked the happiness of a group of people since 1938, the Harvard Grant Study, and found the same thing Dickens did. Here's the conclusion of the lead researcher, George Vallant. The only thing that really matters in life are your relationships to other people. Another aspect science knows about making people happy is the amount of time people spend seeking out how to make other people happy. One of the greatest predictors of happiness turns out to be how outward focused you are on the needs of others. Volunteering, charity work, something to keep the narcissism dogs at bay. This is powerful stuff, folks. People who give out of the abundance of their heart are at lower risk for depression. They seem to receive as much as they give. Scrooge was challenged directly on this point when a group of charity workers came calling. They asked him for a donation, which he refused. He should have said yes. It's funny, you know. A Christmas Carol was written in the 19th century, but there is a lot of 21st century brain science that supports this old narrative thread. One counterintuitive idea concerns what does not make you happy, something that A Christmas Carol almost gleefully celebrates. That has to do with money. Past a certain amount of income, enough to keep you out of poverty, more money doesn't make you statistically much happier. Millionaires are not substantially happier than even the lower middle class. Do you remember what happens to every spectacularly wealthy lottery winner 90 days after they won? They return to whatever baseline happiness they had before they got buckets of cash. Maybe we should not say that lotteries make you happier for a lifetime. Maybe we should say lotteries make you happy for a quarter of a year. This is clearly seen in our next story of an unhappy lottery winner. This guy's story is just as sad as Jack Whittaker's, perhaps sadder because it involves a suicide. I'm bringing up a sad story now because we're about to switch gears. We are going to consider the absence of happiness, all in an attempt to get at a definition. We are about to talk about depression. Here's a quote very similar to lottery winner Jack Whittaker's comment. Quote, "Winning the lottery is the worst thing that ever happened to me." Close quote. That wasn't Jack Whittaker, though. That was Billy Bob Harrell. He won the 1997 Texas Lotto, worth about $31 million at the time. Unlike Jack, who had been fairly successful, Billy's prior life had been mostly a financial failure. He had drifted from job to job, never earning much money to support his wife and 3 kids. You won't be surprised by what happened next. After Billy collected his first annual $1 million plus check, he did what many winners do, bought a bunch of stuff for himself and his family, took his family on an expensive vacation, donated to his church, standard honeymoon, period. But he also did something really stupid. There are companies that leech off of lottery winners, giving them large one-time sums of money in return for their annual earnings. It doesn't always work out well. You can lose big money on these ventures. Billy signed up with one of these scams and lost big money quickly. He and his wife separated within a year. He got depressed. Eventually, Billy uttered his quote about the lottery being the worst thing ever shortly before he blew his brains out. Billy wasn't just unhappy, he was depressed. I want to talk about the flip side of happiness, its absence, this depression business, using Billy's famous cautionary tale. Depression is serious business. It can be life-threatening. More than half of all suicides occur with people who are suffering from clinical depression. At its core, depression is an unusually negative reaction to life. But it's not just feelings of being blue, which might occur, say, after a divorce. And it's not just bereavement, which might occur, say, after a death. Those are all normal reactions to life's hard events. These are not depression. Depression involves a profound change in mood that explicitly affects a person's ability to function. There is often a chronic hopelessness associated with it. At a parlor level, it's the difference between these two sentences. Quote, "There will be no way out now," close quote. Quote, "There will be no way out ever," close quote. This type of hopelessness, which is described by an idea we call learned helplessness theory, is usually accompanied by other changes in behaviors. If you go down the depression road, you not only feel hopeless, you feel different. Your sleep habits often change. You either start getting too much or not enough. Your eating habits become altered. You lose the ability to focus, to make decisions. You quit enjoying things that used to bring you a tremendous amount of happiness. A hallmark is a loss of interest in sex. Depression affects a lot of people. About 70% of all Americans will experience it sometime in their lives. It also skews in the direction of gender. Upwards of about 25% of all females experience depression. That statistic is an overall lifetime risk. Upwards of about 10% of all males will. Depression also afflicts people in different ways. About 40% of anybody who suffers a major depressive illness does so exactly once, recovers from it, and never gets it again. About 50% of people who suffer a major depressive illness don't get that luxury. It will recur again after a period of recovery. About 10% of the people have true hell on earth. They get depressed, and they never recover. Not surprisingly, this is called chronic depression. There is a severity issue with which to contend as well. Some people get severely depressed. Some people don't experience depression, but deal regularly with its lighter cousin, something called dysthymia. You should note that the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which really is the Bible for psychiatric disorders, has gotten rid of the term dysthymia. It has been replaced with the term persistent depressive disorder. Whatever. Dysthymia is a low-level depression that tends to stay with you for years. You wake up in the morning and are immediately persuaded that life sucks. Not hopeless, just icky. That low-level blue mood follows you throughout the day, sort of like a sad dog. Perhaps Eeyore, if you're dysthymic. It's not as intense as depression, like I said, but it is a mood disorder, and it's not all that uncommon. About 2.5% of all Americans will suffer from dysthymia at some point in their lives. So, you can suffer from full-calorie depression or depression light. Both are the opposites of happiness. The interesting thing about depression is that these days it is so darn treatable. Taking advantage of mental health services if you are depressed is about the smartest thing you can do. Now, how does depression work in the brain? To understand it, we have to talk about another neurotransmitter, And to do that, I'd like to discuss a person who seemed to be the most unlikely person ever to suffer from depression. He's the late Mike Wallace. You might recall Mike Wallace, the craggy-faced former chain-smoking leonine investigative reporter from the long-running CBS show 60 Minutes. Mike seemed so smart. He seemed so confident. If I had ever done something wrong and I found out Mike Wallace had a camera crew and wanted to interview me, I would look for the nearest exit. Mike Wallace suffered from depression. He did it in silence for a while, but it became so severe he eventually attempted suicide. Writing a goodbye note before taking a bunch of pills, Mike said the triggering event came from a 60 Minutes piece he'd done on General William Westmoreland, an Army general in command of U.S. troops during the Vietnam War. Among other things, that story led to a libel suit. He wrote in his memoir, Between You and Me, that he fell, quote, more deeply into that dark and devastating malaise which was crushing my spirit and even sapping my will to live, close quote. His wife found him, fortunately, and took Mike to the hospital. There he got his stomach pumped. Mike recovered and lived to the ripe old age of 93. What in the world could work so powerfully in our brains that it could fell a titanic personality like Mike Wallace? Truth is, we don't really know. Suicide is clearly anti-Darwinian, so we obviously have a dysfunction of normal information processing features somewhere in the brain. The biological origins of depression have been under investigation for decades, but it has yielded its secrets only grudgingly. We know some types of depression involve an aberrant balance in the concentration of neurotransmitters between specific neuronal circuits, specifically their reuptake. You might recall we mentioned reuptake in a previous lecture. That's where one neuron spits out a bevy of neurotransmitters to its neighbor during signal transfer. Reuptake is recycling. It's the process whereby those neurotransmitters return like salmon to their origin. A change in the balance of this trafficking is thought to undergird the disorder. Depression is often called a chemical imbalance, in part because of this insight. Progress is certainly being made. We've tried to learn about depression by examining closely the molecular mechanisms of one of the most prescribed class of drugs on Earth, antidepressants. There are many kinds of antidepressants. One of the most popular classes of antidepressants even has the mechanism in their names. They're called SSRIs, short for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Their name suggests this recycling business. They appear to be inhibiting the reuptake process, and in so doing, make some people's moods substantially better. Note that I said some. There are many mysteries regarding what antidepressants may or may not reveal about the disorder. First, many antidepressants take a long time to exert their therapeutic effects. 6 weeks is not all that unusual. Second, they don't work for everybody. A person often has to go through several antidepressant medications or several concentrations of a single medication before they arrive at an effective dose. The best results occur if the person is willing to take the medication under the supervision of a psychotherapist who has an emotional best fit with their client. This is true for most psychiatric disorders. Okay, enough about Mike Wallace. This lecture is not about depression, it's about happiness. In our practical application section, we return to a more optimistic theme and describe known ways to beat back depression and sustain happiness for a lifetime. We begin this section with our final lottery winner story. In fact, we'll do two. They both have happy endings. No alcohol, gambling, or suicides. It's very instructive about what really makes people happy. The first belongs to Les Robbins, a 1993 $111 million Powerball winner, then the record. Les was a junior high teacher, a profession not known for being particularly lucrative. He really needed the money, but not, it turns out, for all that much personal gain. At the outset, Les used his winnings to do charitable work, like many do, but he had the temerity to stick with it. He bought 226 acres and built Camp Winnegator on it. This is a Wisconsin day camp for the local kids. It was still in operation decades later. Les really seemed to enjoy making others happy. A news story at the time found him puttering around the camp in an old Jeep, visiting campers, checking up on staff. Even with his newfound wealth, he continued to volunteer as a coach for a basketball team. Setting up charities is hardly unusual work for lottery winners. What's special about Les is that he continued to do so. Most lottery winners eventually lose interest in their charitable foundations. He remained others-focused. The second example concerns a man named Joe Johnson. The story about his lottery winnings and its happy endings could have come straight from Disney. Joe hailed from England and won about 16 million bucks in their 1998 lottery. He began investing it, bought a bunch of property, got wealthier. 2 years later, Joe found a woman he wanted to date. She was eventually to become the love of his life. Her name was Lisa. Joe began to court Lisa, but he did it in a most unusual way. Joe decided to hide his wealth. This took some effort, but he pulled it off in style, if you'll forgive the words. He decided to drive a beat-up car. He decided to wear plain, unfancy clothing. He didn't give expensive presents. He didn't seem to be all that well off at all. In spite of the budgetary restrictions, the relationship flourished. Eventually, Joe asked her for her hand in marriage, to which she said yes. Only then did Joe reveal the extent of his wealth. He said in an interview, quote, "It was the only way I could ever tell that I was truly loved for who I was, not because of the money." Close quote. The bottom line? Money was mostly a threat to the thing Joe considered most precious. Relationships meant everything to him. The lessons of these stories, service to others, and the value of relationships are important ideas, believe it or not, to the research world. We talked about them earlier in a lecture. These two ideas, as well as a few other behaviors, have been shown to make and sustain genuine happiness in people over the long term. They even buffer against the ravages of depression and anxiety. We're going to talk about 5 of these behaviors as we close our discussion of the topic. It's time to head to our practical application section. Many scientists have researched what sustains subjective well-being over the years of life. Martin Seligman, the well-regarded psychologist who came up with the notion of that happiness set range, has codified his research as well as his findings from others into a 5-letter acrostic he calls PERMA, P-E-R-M-A. PERMA stands for the 5 foundational elements people need to be experiencing to maximize their SWB. Here's a brief description of each letter. P stands for positive emotion. To keep the dogs of depression away, you need to be regularly experiencing positive feelings and emotions. These include experiences like pleasure, which we discussed last lecture, and gratitude for the good things in your life, hopeful for the future. It helps if you are curious about your world and are regularly inspired by what you observe. There are live-in-the-moment arguments here, too. People with sustained SWB have a willingness to enjoy the present for its very own sake. Marty suggests that in the evening, you write down 3 positive things that happened to you that day, along with a brief description of why they were important, so you can capture those moments. E stands for engagement. When you are truly involved in a meaningful activity, a lot of interesting things happen to you. Marty thinks you should be regularly experiencing those things. Those things include feeling lost in a project. It should be an activity so meaningful that you lose track of time, lose track of where you are, lose track of even who you are. The great psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi calls this flow, where creative energy is at its maximum and joy is at its creamy center. R stands for relationships, as in positive relationships, something we've mentioned here twice. Marty thinks you should have lots of positive relationships with friends and be regularly interacting with them, family too. As we will discuss in more detail in lecture number 15, having lots of relationships is a powerful bulwark against depression. You can see that in the priorities of Joe Johnson, the Brit who courted the love of his life without telling her of his riches. As the anecdote goes, nobody on their deathbed ever said, "Gee, I wish I had spent more time in the office." Almost universally, we believe, "Gee, I wish I had spent more time with my loved ones." M stands for meaning. This is the argument in constant service to something that is larger than you are. God, a cause, an idea, a charity, something that continually forces you out of your own experiences and into the experiences of others. Les Robbins, the lottery winner teacher who started this Wisconsin summer camp, that's a fine example. There is actually a pro-social twinge to this idea, which is why the word charity is included in the notion. The idea that doing good for people by serving something larger than you is another way of doing good for yourself. A stands for accomplishment or achievement. The idea is to achieve some goal, create a mastery over some skill in the service of that goal, something achievable so that a sense of accomplishment is explicitly experienced. Running a marathon comes to mind, especially if you've never done one before. In our hyper-competitive society, it is easy to make this a bridge too far, which makes this, in my view, the most misunderstood of the five. This category is not asking you to burn yourself out. We can slip into a depression simply because we burn ourselves out. It is simply an appeal not to be listless or unfocused. Depressed people often experience both, but instead set a goal that leads to an achievement. So, we come full circle and are left with something of a conundrum. Even though we really don't have a definition of happiness, we know enough to be able to make some recommendations about how to get happiness and sustain it. Mostly, it involves a willingness not to be self-centered at its core. Such a conundrum is decidedly not true of the next lecture topic. This we know a great deal about. Its origins, its psychology, its biology. So did Jack Whitaker, the guy who lost so much of his winnings on booze and gambling. That subject is stress.